1978, deep inside a fortified GRU compound outside Moscow, laughter echoed through a smoke-filled briefing room. It began as a low chuckle from a veteran tanker who had spent his life surrounded by diesel fumes and steel hulls, then spread across the table like a private joke everyone understood. Maps of Western Europe covered the walls, thick red arrows driving relentlessly toward the Fulda Gap. On a flickering projector screen hung a grainy technical schematic smuggled from a Western journal, America's newest tank, still known only as XM1. A senior colonel stood, pointer in hand, his expression flat and unimpressed. He tapped the image. An aircraft engine, he said, in a tank. The room stirred again. A general at the head of the table leaned back, medals heavy on his chest, cigarette glowing between his fingers. An aircraft engine? He repeated. What do they plan to do? Fly over Germany? More laughter followed, confident and unafraid. To these men, veterans of Kursk, Hungary, and decades of armored exercises, the design looked absurd. The colonel continued, listing figures with quiet contempt. 55 tons projected, 60 with full armor. Our T-64 weighs 36. The T-72 barely 41. This American monster will drown in the first muddy field it meets. He shook his head at the maintenance estimates. Air filters, precision parts, specialized crews. They will need engineers, not soldiers. On paper, the XM1 violated every principle Soviet armored doctrine held sacred. The Red Army's faith rested in the T-72, compact, low profile, brutally efficient. Its autoloader fed a powerful 125mm gun without the need for a fourth crewman, cutting costs, weight, and training time. It was designed to be built fast, repaired fast, and replaced fast. A tank for mass war, not individual survival. Soviet strategy demanded numbers. In the event of war, thousands of tanks would surge west in a steel tide, overwhelming NATO defenses through speed and violence. Individual duels did not matter. Momentum did. Against Leopard 1s, Chieftains, and American M60s, the T-72 was expected to win often enough and cheaply enough to keep the advance rolling. The XM1 seemed to reject this reality. Intelligence estimates painted it as a logistical parasite. Its gas turbine drank fuel at an alarming rate, tying it to vulnerable supply columns. Its heat signature would glow like an aircraft beacon. Its electronics appeared delicate, filled with computers unsuited for mud, shock, and artillery fire. The verdict felt obvious. It is a defensive machine, the general finally concluded, crushing out a cigarette. A showpiece, designed to sit still, consume fuel, and impress politicians. It will not survive a real war. Not our war. Heads nodded, pen scratched. The report was filed and archived. Production quotas for the T-72 remained unchanged. Training manuals reinforced confidence. The laughter faded into certainty. What none of them recognized was that they were not witnessing incompetence, but a different philosophy entirely. They saw decadence where there was intent, excess where there was calculation. The assumptions forged in that room would harden into doctrine, shaping how the Soviet Union prepared for the next war. The laughter of 1978 was not harmless. It was the opening note of miscalculation that would take more than a decade to reveal itself. And when it finally did, it would not echo in a Moscow briefing room, but across a battlefield where disbelief arrived too late. That failure of imagination would shape training, budgets, and beliefs, ensuring that when the test finally came, the shock would be total, public, and irreversible for everyone who once laughed in that room in Moscow again forever remembered. While the laughter in Moscow hardened into doctrine, Soviet armored theory marched forward with absolute confidence. The Red Army's concept of war was not built around duels or individual brilliance, but inevitability. If war came, it would come fast, violent, and everywhere at once. This doctrine was called deep battle, and envisioned armored armies tearing through NATO defenses in a continuous wave, bypassing resistance and collapsing the enemy system from the inside. Quantity was a decisive weapon. Speed was a shield. Soviet planners believed that NATO forces would be paralyzed by shock before they could respond effectively. Airfields would be overrun, supply depots crushed, command centers shattered. Victory would be measured in hours, not weeks. The T-72 was designed as the perfect instrument for this vision. Low, fast, and lethal, it sacrificed comfort and protection for production speed and battlefield momentum. Crews were trained quickly, often conscripts, taught procedures rather than tactics. Survival was secondary. The mission was everything. American thinking moved in the opposite direction. NATO knew it could never match Soviet numbers. Every study, every war game, every classified projection reached the same conclusion. Mass would lose. The only path forward was lethality at distance, survivability under fire, and crews capable of exploiting both. This divergence shaped everything that followed. Where the Soviets sought simplicity, the Americans embraced complexity. Where Soviet engineers minimized silhouettes, American designers accepted bulk. Where the Red Army treated tanks as expendable tools, the U.S. Army treated crews as assets worth protecting. To Soviet intelligence, this philosophy looked like weakness. Reports from spies and attaches reinforced the belief that the XM-1 was over-engineered and underprepared. Turbine failures in desert tests. Electronics requiring constant calibration. Costs spiraling beyond control. Every flaw confirmed expectations. What Soviet analysts did not grasp was that the Abrams was not meant to fight the same war they envisioned. It was designed for a battlefield saturated with sensors, aircraft, and precision weapons. It was built to fight at night, in smoke, in chaos, and to kill before being seen. This difference was invisible on paper. Schematics showed weight and engines, not doctrine. Tables listed armor thickness, not survivability concepts. The Soviets believed they were evaluating a tank. In reality, they were judging a system they did not yet understand. As these assumptions solidified, training adjusted accordingly. Soviet crews were taught to close distance aggressively, swarm targets, and overwhelm Western tanks at close range. The belief was simple. Numbers would erase technology. If contact was made, victory would follow. No one in that system asked the most dangerous question. What if the Americans were not trying to match Soviet doctrine at all? What if they were preparing to negate it entirely? That question remained unspoken, buried under certainty. By the early 1980s, the divide was complete. Two armies prepared for two different wars, each convinced the other was wrong. The Soviets trusted mass and momentum. The Americans trusted information and precision. Neither side would truly know the answer until steel met steel, far from Europe, under conditions no planner in Moscow had ever imagined. That collision was coming. It would arrive not as theory, but as fire, heat, and shock. And when it did, decades of assumptions would be tested in minutes, revealing which vision of armored warfare belonged to past. The Soviets believed history was on their side. They trusted experience, numbers, and momentum. They believed the Abrams was a mistake born of decadence. Soon, reality would answer each belief with precision, distance, and unforgiving speed, delivered without warning from beyond their vision and preparation, and doctrine alone collapsed. The real secret of the M1 Abrams was never visible on blueprints. Soviet intelligence could count road wheels, measure engine output, and estimate armor weight, but the most dangerous elements of the tank were invisible. They were buried behind steel plates, sealed inside armored housings, and written off as fragile indulgences by analysts who had already decided what the Abrams was supposed to be. Soviet doctrine assumed that tanks fought what they could see. Visibility defined combat. Night fighting existed, but it was crude. Active infrared systems flooded the battlefield with invisible light, allowing crews to see, but also revealing their exact position to anyone else using similar equipment. Darkness was never neutral. It was always compromised. The Abrams changed that equation completely. American engineers had built the first true hunter-killer tank. In Soviet designs, the commander observed while the gunner fired. The process was sequential and slow. In the Abrams, the commander hunted independently. His fully stabilized thermal viewer scanned the battlefield while the gunner engaged targets. The moment the commander identified a new threat, he pressed a button. The turret slewed instantly. The gunner's sights were already aligned. Seconds mattered. The Abrams turned seconds into death. Thermal imaging was a decisive break. It did not emit light. It did not announce its presence. It was a passive sensor that saw heat itself. Engines glowed. Exhaust shimmered. Tracks burned faint signatures into the ground. Smoke, fog, darkness, none of it mattered. To an Abrams crew, the battlefield was always illuminated. Soviet analysts knew of thermal technology in theory, but they did not believe it could function reliably under combat conditions. They assumed vibration, dust, and shock would degrade the system. They assumed maintenance would cripple it. They assumed complexity equal fragility. They were wrong. The Abrams fire control system fused multiple inputs into a single solution. Laser range-finding measures distance instantly. Wind sensors accounted for a crosswind. Barrel distortion was calculated automatically. Ammunition temperature was factored in. The gunner did not guess. He did not adjust. He pressed a button and fired. The first round was lethal. Soviet tanks still relied on experience and estimation. Crews walked rounds on the targets. Each misrevealed position. Each correction consumed time. Against older NATO tanks, this was acceptable. Against the Abrams, it was fatal. The difference was not just accuracy. It was tempo. Abrams crews could engage multiple targets faster than Soviet crews could respond to one. What looked like complexity was actually speed distilled into machinery. Even the turbine engine, mocked for its fuel appetite, played a role. At idle, it was quieter than a diesel. In an ambush, Abrams tanks waited silently. When movement was required, acceleration was immediate. The tanks surged, fired, and vanished before return fire arrived. Soviet crews had trained for static engagements or slow advances. They were unprepared for a 60-ton vehicle that moved like something alive. None of this fit Soviet expectations. Their models assumed equal visibility, equal engagement ranges, and equal reaction times. The Abrams shattered those assumptions. What Soviet intelligence never grasped was that the Abrams was not designed to fight Soviet tanks as they imagined themselves. It was designed to fight them as they actually were, blind, slower to react, and dependent on mass. By the late 1980s, the systems were mature. Crews were trained relentlessly. What had been dismissed as decadence was now doctrine. The dragon had grown its eyes. All that remained was a battlefield where illusions would burn away, leaving only what worked. The confrontation the Soviets had prepared for was supposed to happen in Europe. Forests, rolling hills, rivers, villages, and narrow corridors like the Fulda-Gap shaped every exercise, every map, every war game. Their doctrine was written for Central Europe, where terrain would compress movement and mass would crush resistance. What they never planned for was a vast, empty battlefield where distance itself became a weapon. That battlefield was the desert. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the world's attention shifted to a place far removed from Cold War expectations. Southern Iraq and northern Saudi Arabia offered almost no cover. The land was flat, open, and featureless, broken only by low ridgelines and shallow depressions. Visibility, under normal conditions, stretched for kilometers. Under abnormal conditions, it vanished entirely. Iraq's army was not the Red Army, but it was its reflection. Its officers were trained in Soviet academies. Its doctrine was Soviet deep battle. Its tanks were Soviet designs. The Republican Guard believed in mass, defensive belts, and layered armor. They believed, just as Moscow once had, that American tanks were heavy, thirsty, and overrated. They dug in. Hundreds of T-72 tanks were positioned in prepared revetments. Hull-down positions were scraped into the sand. Artillery was registered. Infantry waited nearby. They expected an attack during daylight, after air strikes, when dust and smoke would limit visibility but not blind them completely. Then the weather turned. A shamal rolled in from the north, a violent sandstorm that swallowed the horizon. Visibility dropped to less than 100 meters. Winds howled. Sand scoured exposed metal. To Iraqi crews, the storm was protection. Their active infrared systems were useless. The infrared light scattered back into white noise. Nothing could move. Nothing could be seen. They were wrong. For American armored units, this was not chaos. It was an opportunity. Thermal sights ignored sand. Heat signatures cut through the storm like flares. Tanks that could not see became targets that could not hide. On the night of February 26, 1991. U.S. armored cavalry units pushed forward into terrain Iraqi commanders believed impassable. They moved by instruments and thermal images. Crews advanced deliberately, scanning, stopping, scanning again. What they saw were glowing shapes. Tanks, trucks, infantry positions laid out across the desert. The engagement ranges were unlike anything seen before. 2,000 meters was routine. 3,000 meters was possible. Iraqi tanks could not respond because they did not know they were under attack until explosions tore through their formations. This was not a duel. It was detection followed by execution. American commanders controlled the pace. They chose when to fire, when to maneuver, and when to disengage. The Abrams speed allowed rapid repositioning. Crews crested ridges, fired, reversed, and disappeared. Return fire arrived seconds too late, aimed at empty sand. Iraqi units attempted to counterattack, but coordination collapsed immediately. Radios failed. Orders became confused. Tanks fired blindly into the storm. Some never fired at all. Their doctrine assumed mutual visibility. Without it, everything unraveled. What had been theoretical for decades was now brutally concrete. The Abrams was not fighting tanks. It was hunting them. By dawn, entire Iraqi formations had ceased to exist as fighting units. Positions that had taken weeks to prepare were erased in minutes. Survivors abandoned vehicles and fled on foot. The battlefield the Soviets had imagined, crowded, constrained, chaotic, never materialized. Instead, war unfolded at a distance they could not cross. And somewhere far away, the assumptions written into decades of doctrine began to collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence. The collision between doctrine and reality reached its climax at a place marked only by a line on a map. It was called 73 Easting, a north-south grid coordinate in the featureless desert of southern Iraq. There were no towns, no landmarks, no terrain worth naming. It was perfect ground for a fight that would not resemble any battle the Iraqi crews, or their Soviet instructors, had prepared for. As the sandstorm continued to rage, elements of the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment advanced eastward, probing for Republican Guard units. The wind screamed across the hulls. Sand-hammered optics and armor. Visibility to the naked eye was almost non-existent. To Iraqi crews hunkered down in their revetments, the storm felt like a protective curtain. Nothing could attack in this. Inside American Abrams tanks, the world looked completely different. Thermal sights cut through the storm effortlessly. Iraqi tanks glowed like lanterns against the cold desert background. Engines idling for hours radiated heat. Recently moved vehicles burned brighter still. Even disturbed sand betrayed positions. What Iraqi commanders believed was concealment had become exposure. The first shots came without warning. An Abrams gunner acquired a thermal silhouette at over 2,000 meters. Laser. Fire. The depleted uranium round struck with surgical violence. The T-72s' armor failed instantly. Ammunition cooked off. The turret launched skyward. Before the explosion's echo faded, another Abrams fired. Then another. The engagement unfolded in seconds. Iraqi crews had no idea where the shots were coming from. Their optics showed nothing but swirling sand. Their infrared systems reflected noise. They fired blindly, hoping volume might compensate for ignorance. It did not. American crews operated with calm precision. Targets were called, assigned, destroyed, and reassigned. The hunter-killer system allowed continuous engagement. While one tank fired, another scanned. While one reversed, another advanced. The flow never stopped. At ranges where Iraqi gunners could not even identify an enemy, Abrams crews were scoring first-round kills. 2 kilometers, 2,500 meters. In some cases, more. The range advantage alone broke any chance of parity. Add superior optics, faster engagement cycles, and heavier armor, and the outcome was inevitable. Entire Iraqi platoons were erased before they understood they were under attack. One engagement blurred into the next. Burning wrecks littered the sand. Survivors abandoned vehicles, running blindly into the storm. Some tried to surrender. Others simply froze. The Republican Guard, trained to fight en masse, found itself dismantled piece by piece. In just 23 minutes, 9 Abrams tanks destroyed an entire Iraqi armor battalion. Not a single Abrams was lost. Not one was disabled by enemy tank fire. The ratio was not lopsided. It was absolute. For the Abrams crews, this was not chaos. It was confirmation. Everything they had trained for at the proving grounds and simulators now existed in reality. The drills worked. The systems held. The tank performed exactly as designed. For Iraqi forces, and for observers in Moscow watching from afar, it was a catastrophic revelation. The theories that had dismissed the Abrams collapsed instantly. The logistical leash did not matter. The electronics did not fail. The heavy tank did not sit defensively. It advanced, hunted, and annihilated. 73 Easting was not just a battle. It was an autopsy of Soviet armor doctrine, conducted in real time. Every assumption was tested. Everyone failed. The laughter that began in a Moscow briefing room 13 years earlier finally died here, buried beneath twisted steel and burning sand. When the Desert War ended, the numbers told a story no ideology could escape. In 100 hours of ground combat, American armored forces destroyed thousands of Iraqi vehicles, including hundreds of T-72 tanks. In return, only a handful of M1 Abrams were lost, none to enemy tank fire. No Abrams crewman was killed by a T-72. The imbalance was so extreme it sounded implausible, yet every report confirmed it. This was not luck. It was not a circumstance. It was design. The Abrams had not merely defeated the T-72. It had invalidated the philosophy that created it. Soviet armored doctrine had been built on the belief that quantity could compensate for quality, that simplicity ensured reliability, and that courage in mass could overwhelm technology. In Iraq, those assumptions disintegrated under modern combat conditions. The core failure was not armor thickness or gun caliber. It was perception. The Soviet system had treated the tank as a blunt instrument operated by expendable crews. Information was secondary. Survival was statistical. Losses were expected and accepted. The Abrams reversed that logic completely. It was built around the crew. Every system existed to keep them alive, aware and lethal. Information was the weapon. Sensors extended human vision. Computers eliminated guesswork. Training turned crews into professionals capable of independent decision-making. The tank became an extension of human perception rather than a steel coffin. Soviet responses came too late and addressed the wrong problems. Explosive reactive armor was improved. Missiles were developed to fire from tank guns. Armor arrays grew heavier. Yet none of these changes fixed the fundamental issue. The tanks were still blind. The crews still relied on line of sight. The doctrine still assumed mutual visibility and symmetrical engagement. The battlefield had moved on. The Cold War's central illusion had been exposed. The Soviet Union believed it could match the West by copying outputs, tanks, missiles, aircraft, without replicating the ecosystem that produced them. Innovation, competition, failure, and iteration were seen as inefficiencies. In reality, they were strengths. The Abrams was not the product of a single breakthrough. It was a result of decades of accumulated advantages in electronics, materials science, computing, and training culture. These were not things that could be stolen or replicated quickly. They required an entire system built to support them. By the time the lesson became undeniable, it was already irrelevant. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Its economy could not sustain the technological leap required to close the gap. Its doctrine, optimized for another era, had nowhere to evolve. The laughter from 1978 returned one final time, not as arrogance, but as irony. The tank dismissed as decadent had proven unstoppable. The machine mocked for excess had delivered decisive efficiency. The paper tiger had been revealed as something else entirely. The legacy of the Abrams is not measured only in destroyed tanks. It marked the end of mass as a substitute for mastery. It proved that information dominance could outweigh numerical superiority. It demonstrated that survivability and lethality were not opposing goals, but complementary ones. War did not become safer after this revelation. It became more precise, more asymmetric, more unforgiving to those who failed to adapt. The question the Soviets never asked became unavoidable for every military that followed. What happens when the enemy sees first, understands first, and fires first? At 73 Easting, the answer arrived from 3,000 meters away, carried on the wind, written in fire. That answer did not just end a battle.